Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The sterile fluorescent lights of the underground facility cast harsh shadows across Carter's face as he made his way down the long corridor of maximum security. His boots echoed against polished concrete, each step deliberate, measured. The weight of his new security clearance badge felt heavy against his chest. Heavier still was the warning that had accompanied it. Cell 9 is off limits except for scheduled monitoring, Security Chief Voss had told him during orientation, her voice dropping to a near whisper despite the empty briefing room. The specimen inside isn't just dangerous, she's a walking death sentence. Carter had nodded, watching as Voss's weathered face hardened. Don't feed her. Don't talk to her. Voss had leaned closer then, eyes narrowing. And whatever you do, don't look her in the eyes. The last guard who did, well, let's just say he doesn't work here anymore. Lost 3 fingers before we could pull him back. Now 3 weeks into his deployment at the facility, Carter found himself drawn to Cell 9 like a moth to flame. His official duties rarely brought him to this isolated wing, yet he'd invented reasons to pass by. Equipment checks, perimeter sweeps, inventory counts. Each time, he'd steal a glance at the reinforced viewing panel, catching glimpses of the being inside. His third pass this week wasn't part of any duty roster. It was pure curiosity, or perhaps something deeper. The creature, no, woman, he corrected himself mentally, sat hunched in the corner of her cell. Even seated, she towered over the reinforced furniture, her massive frame barely contained by the specially designed chamber. The ceiling of Cell 9 was twice the height of standard cells, the walls 3 times as thick, yet she made the space seem cramped, claustrophobic. Carter estimated she must stand at least 11 feet tall when upright, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway. The guards had names for her: the Giant, the Untouchable, the Beast of 9. They never approached her cell alone, and even in pairs they kept their distance, weapons drawn. Carter had overheard stories in the mess hall of how she had nearly torn a research assistant in half during her capture, how she had crushed a guard's helmet with his head still inside it when he'd ventured too close. But something was different today. She wasn't moving, not pacing, not testing the boundaries of her restraints, not even the usual heavy breathing that had reminded Carter of a predator at rest. She was perfectly still, too still. Carter slowed his pace, hesitating outside the cell. Protocol dictated he should alert medical if a prisoner showed signs of distress, but the reports he'd seen suggested this particular prisoner wasn't considered worth the resources. He glanced down the empty corridor, then back at the cell. The monitor beside the door displayed her vitals. Heart rate dangerously slow, body temperature dropping. She was starving. And based on the logs he'd accessed yesterday, this wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. The realization settled in his stomach like a cold stone. The entire research team, the security detail, even the custodial staff, they were deliberately starving her, and they were enjoying it. He'd heard the jokes in the mess hall, the casual cruelty of researchers discussing specimen behavior under stress conditions. He'd seen the way guards would tap their batons against her cell door just to watch her flinch. Carter wasn't naive. He'd served in military installations with questionable ethics before, but this was something else entirely. Without fully processing his decision, Carter found himself walking back toward the mess hall. The evening shift was winding down, most personnel already headed to their quarters. He filled a tray with whatever was left, some kind of protein stew, synthetic bread, a cup of purified water. Nothing special, barely edible by human standards, but food nonetheless. He didn't allow himself to think about what he was doing as he returned to Cell 9. Didn't acknowledge the security protocols he was violating, the explicit orders he was defying. He just walked, tray in hand, back straight, eyes forward, as if on a perfectly routine assignment. As he approached Cell 9, a passing guard noticed the tray and stopped dead in his tracks. "What the hell are you doing, Reed?" The guard, Peterson, asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and alarm. "Feeding the prisoner," Carter replied evenly. Peterson moved closer, lowering his voice. "Are you insane? That thing in there hasn't been fed in 3 days for a reason. It's part of the behavioral study. She's dying. It's not a she, Reed. And if it dies, that's one less nightmare we have to worry about." Peterson placed a hand on Carter's shoulder. "Look, I get it. You're new, but trust me, you don't want to get close to that feeding slot. It'll take your arm off before you can blink. Carter met the man's gaze steadily. I'll take my chances. Your funeral, Peterson muttered, backing away. Don't say I didn't warn you. The feeding slot was simple enough. A narrow, reinforced opening at the bottom of the door, designed to allow trays to slide through without compromising security. Carter knelt, every movement watched by Peterson and now two other staff members, who had paused their duties to witness what they clearly expected to be a bloody spectacle. Time seemed to slow as Carter balanced the tray carefully and pushed it through the slot. The entire corridor fell silent, all eyes fixed on his exposed hands as they crossed the threshold into her domain. He kept his eyes down, fixed on the task, deliberately avoiding looking into the cell. But then, a whisper of movement, followed by a rush of air as something massive shifted position within. The other observers instinctively stepped back. Carter held his ground, hands still extended through the slot. A shadow fell across his fingers. Enormous. Alien. Then came the touch, the lightest brush of blue fingers against his own. Large enough to engulf his entire hand, with an extra joint in each digit. Calloused skin crisscrossed with pale scars. And trembling. Whether from weakness or emotion, he couldn't tell. Carter froze. The moment stretched between them, his fingers still extended through the slot, her touch still feather-light against his skin. Neither moving, neither breathing. Then slowly, she withdrew. The tray disappeared into the shadows of the cell. No words, no sound. Carter remained kneeling, listening to the soft scrape of utensils, the quiet desperation with which she ate. When the sound stopped, he reached for the tray, expecting her to return it through the slot. Instead, he felt those fingers again, this time pressing something into his palm. He withdrew his hand to find a small object, a piece of the synthetic bread, torn into a rough approximation of a five-pointed star. A gift, or perhaps a message. Carter closed his fist around it, pocketed it, and walked away without looking back. Behind him, he heard Peterson's disbelieving whisper to another guard. She's never taken food from anyone before, not without trying to grab them through the slot. The next day, he came again. Got yourself a soft spot for monsters, Reed? Carter didn't look up from his console as Technician Mercer leaned against the doorframe of the monitoring station, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The use of his surname, Reed, was deliberate, a reminder that in this facility, first names were reserved for those considered equals. Just doing my job, Carter replied evenly, continuing to log maintenance reports. Sure you are. Mercer sauntered closer, lowering his voice. Word gets around in a place this size, you know. People notice when someone starts making unscheduled trips to restricted areas. Carter kept his expression neutral. Years of military discipline serving him well. If you have a concern about my conduct, take it up with Voss. Oh, I'm not concerned. Mercer's grin widened, revealing too many teeth. Just curious what you think you're doing. That thing in there? It's not some misunderstood creature. It's killed people. Ripped them apart with those hands you seem so fascinated by. Carter finished his report and stood, a good 3 inches taller than Mercer. Thanks for the warning, he said, brushing past the technician. But Mercer caught his arm, voice dropping to a whisper. You know what they did to the last guy who got attached, right? It wasn't just reassignment. Carter pulled his arm free, holding Mercer's gaze for a long, silent moment before walking away. She's chosen you, Reed, Mercer called after him. That's what they do. They pick one, and they never let go. Not with their hands, not with their minds. Despite the warning, or perhaps because of it, Carter found himself drawn back to Cell 9 after his shift ended. The tray he carried tonight held slightly more food than before, including a portion of the synthetic fruit that had been available in the mess hall. As he approached the cell, he noticed something unusual. The guards normally stationed in this section were maintaining an even greater distance than usual, their eyes fixed on the cell door with obvious unease. I wouldn't go near there today, one of them warned as Carter passed. The giant's been restless since you fed it yesterday. Hasn't slept, just watches the door. Carter nodded his acknowledgement but continued forward. When he reached the cell, he understood the guard's concern. She wasn't in her usual corner. She was directly beside the door, her massive form casting a shadow that engulfed the entire viewing panel. Even through the reinforced barrier, he could feel the weight of her presence, like standing next to a living mountain. This time, when he knelt at the feeding slot, he allowed himself to look up. She was sitting closer to the door now, hunched forward but still towering, her massive shoulders nearly scraping the ceiling even in this position. Her form was colossal even seated, powerful limbs thick as tree trunks, a head that seemed almost too large for her frame. In the dim light, he could make out the pattern of ridges that ran from her forehead down her neck, disappearing beneath the rough spun garment that served as her prison uniform. As he slid the tray through, she reached for it without hesitation. But this time her eyes met his. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Large, almond-shaped, with vertical pupils like a cat's. But it was their color that caught him off guard. A deep, luminous amber that seemed to glow from within. Carter felt a jolt of something that wasn't quite fear pass through him. It was more like recognition. As if something ancient and primal in his DNA remembered her kind, remembered what it meant to be regarded by those eyes. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same intensity with which he studied her. Then to his surprise, she mimicked his posture, kneeling as he was kneeling, hands positioned exactly as his were. Not mocking, learning. She took the tray but didn't immediately begin eating. Instead, she waited, watching him, until he made a small gesture toward the food. Only then did she pick up the utensil, her movements a careful mirror of how she must have seen humans eat. What struck Carter most was how the tray, designed for human proportions, looked like a child's toy in her massive hands. Yet she handled it with extraordinary delicacy, as if afraid to break it. Behind him, he heard a guard whisper to another, "She's never waited for permission before. Always just grabbed the food and retreated." "It's not waiting for permission," the other replied. "It's watching him, learning him." Carter found himself wondering how long she'd been here, how much of her behavior was instinctive, and how much was adaptation to captivity. The files he'd managed to access were heavily redacted, revealing little beyond basic physiological data and security protocols. But her eyes, they told a different story. They weren't the eyes of a mindless beast. They burned with intelligence, with awareness, and something that wasn't hatred anymore. From the shadows of the monitoring station across the hall, Lieutenant Harlow watched Carter's interaction with the alien with narrowed eyes. Harlow had been at the facility longer than most, had been part of the team that brought the specimen in. He lost friends to those blue hands, watched as they tore through combat armor like paper. And now this newcomer, this Reed, was treating it like a pet, like something worthy of kindness. The sight made bile rise in Harlow's throat. It wasn't just disgust. It was something deeper, more personal, something that made his fists clench until his knuckles turned white. Jealousy. Because for all his years of service, for all his sacrifices, Harlow had never received the kind of attention that Reed was getting. The whispers in the corridors, the speculative glances from research staff, even Voss's peculiar interest in the man's reports, all of it should have been his. He'd tried everything to advance his position here, had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, had put in extra hours studying xenobiological data, had made himself indispensable to operations. Yet here was Reed, barely a month into his deployment, already making waves, already being noticed. As Carter walked away from Cell 9, Harlow slipped back into the shadows. His decision was made. If Reed wanted to break protocol, that was fine. But there would be consequences. He would make sure of it. Days turned to weeks. Carter's visits became a ritual, anticipated by both of them. He began bringing small items along with the food, a pen that had run out of ink, a button that had fallen from his uniform, a scrap of paper with the facility's logo. Insignificant things, worthless to anyone else. But she treated each one like a precious artifact, arranging them in careful patterns on the floor of her cell. She never spoke, but she communicated in other ways, through gestures, through the arrangements of the objects he brought her, through the intensity of her gaze. The staff noticed, of course. Whispers followed Carter through the corridors. His security clearance was audited twice. What disturbed the others most was not just his visits, but how the massive alien, who had attacked nearly everyone who came close before, now moved her enormous bulk protectively toward the feeding slot whenever Carter appeared. How she would watch the corridor through the viewing panel, her gigantic frame tense and alert, until he arrived. How she would position her body between him and any other personnel who approached during his visits. She's protecting him, he overheard one researcher say, like he's her territory now. Or her pet, another replied. Voss called him in for a routine evaluation that felt more like an interrogation. Your record indicates minimal prior experience with non-terrestrial entities, she said, scrolling through his file on her tablet. Yet you seem remarkably comfortable around the specimen in cell 9. Just doing my job, ma'am, Carter replied, the lie coming easily now with repetition. Voss looked up, her expression unreadable. Your job doesn't include feeding it off-schedule meals from your own rations. Carter said nothing, maintaining eye contact. Denial would be pointless. You know what it did to the research team that brought it in, don't you? Voss continued, setting down her tablet. 3 dead, 2 more with injuries so severe they'll never work in the field again. With all due respect, ma'am, I've reviewed those reports. The specimen was defending itself after being wounded during capture. Defending itself. Voss repeated the words slowly, as if tasting something bitter. That's an interesting interpretation of events, Reed. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. The higher-ups are getting nervous about your interactions. Some are suggesting reassignment. Others have more permanent solutions in mind. Carter felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. Are you threatening me, ma'am? I'm warning you. Voss held his gaze. Whatever you think you're doing with that creature, whatever connection you imagine exists, it's not real. It's studying you, learning your weaknesses, and when the moment comes, it won't hesitate to use them against you. As Carter was dismissed and walked toward the door, Voss added one final comment. By the way, Lieutenant Harlow has submitted a formal report regarding your conduct. Quite detailed, quite concerned. Carter paused, his hand on the door. Harlow, he repeated, remembering the lieutenant's cold stares in the mess hall, the way he'd made a point of avoiding direct interaction despite their overlapping duties. Yes, seems he's been observing your visits to Cell 9 for some time now. Recorded times, durations, items brought. Voss watched Carter's reaction carefully. Very thorough. Carter said nothing, but inside pieces clicked into place. The increased security checks on his quarters, the reassignment of his duties to areas further from the high containment wing, the subtle isolation from other staff, all Harlow's doing. Thank you for informing me, ma'am, he said finally, his voice controlled. Don't thank me, Reed. Watch your back. Voss returned to her tablet, a clear dismissal. The conversation lingered in Carter's mind as he made his way through the facility's maze-like corridors. Was Voss right? Was he projecting humanity onto something fundamentally inhuman? Seeing intelligence where there was only instinct? Empathy where there was only mimicry? His doubts faded the moment he arrived at Cell 9 that evening. She was waiting for him, as always, her colossal form somehow seeming less threatening now, despite her size. He noticed how she shifted her massive body to allow him a better view through the panel, how she carefully arranged the objects he'd brought her into precise patterns. But tonight, something was different. The objects he'd brought her, the pen, the button, the scraps of paper, had been arranged on the floor in a pattern that unmistakably resembled the layout of the facility. A map. She'd created a map. And in the center, 2 small objects, a blue button and a red paperclip, placed side by side. Us, Carter realized. She's showing us. But there was something else. At the edge of the arrangement, separate from the main pattern, she'd placed a security badge. Not his, but similar. Next to it, a piece of torn fabric in the distinctive gray-green of officer uniforms, carefully twisted into a shape that suggested a watching figure. A warning. She knew about Harlow. Somehow, she knew. The incident occurred on a night when Carter had been assigned to oversee a supply delivery, breaking his usual routine. By the time he'd finished processing the shipment, it was well past midnight, the facility operating on minimal staffing. He'd intended to skip his visit to Cell 9, to return to his quarters and catch what little sleep he could before his next shift. But as he passed through the security checkpoint near the high containment wing, he heard it, laughter, cruel and sharp. Carter changed course, moving quickly toward the sound. As he rounded the corner to the hallway containing Cell 9, he saw them, 2 guards, Wallace and Diaz, standing at her cell door. The feeding slot was open, and they were taking turns tossing small objects inside. Come on, freak, you want it. Beg for it, Wallace was saying. dangling what looked like a ration bar just out of reach. "Let's hear you make some noise." Diaz laughed, recording the scene on his personal device. Another violation of protocol. "The doc says they might have vocal cords similar to ours. Maybe we can teach it to talk." Carter approached silently, years of tactical training taking over. Neither guard noticed him until he was directly behind them. "What's going on here?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but both men startled visibly. Wallace recovered first, straightening up with a smirk. "Just having some fun with the monster. No harm done." "Return to your posts." Carter kept his tone level. "Now, technically we're on break," Diaz countered, tucking his device into his pocket. "And technically you don't outrank us, Reed." "But I do outrank you," came a new voice. Lieutenant Park, the night shift supervisor, approaching from the other end of the corridor. "And I'm not seeing authorized recreation on the duty roster for this section." The guards exchanged glances, their bravado deflating. "We were just leaving, sir," Wallace muttered, closing the feeding slot. As they retreated, Park gave Carter a measured look. "You too, Reed. This area is restricted during night shift unless you have clearance." Carter nodded, turning to follow the guards. But before he could take a step, a sound from within the cell froze all four men in place. A low growl, building in intensity until it vibrated through the walls. Then, an impact so violent the reinforced door bulged outward, the metal groaning in protest. Another impact. The security panel beside the door sparked and went dark. "What the hell?" Park started, reaching for his weapon. The third impact tore the door from its hinges. She emerged from the darkness like something from a nightmare. 11 feet of coiled muscle and rage, eyes blazing, the restraints that should have kept her secured, dangling broken from her wrists. Her skin had darkened to a deep indigo, the ridges along her body raised and flaring. The cell that had been specially reinforced to contain her now seemed absurdly inadequate, like a paper cage trying to hold back a tsunami. Wallace and Diaz stood paralyzed with terror. Park managed to draw his weapon, but before he could aim, she was on them. It happened so fast Carter could barely process it. She seized Wallace by the throat, lifting him off the ground with one massive hand as if he weighed nothing. Diaz fumbled for his baton, only to be sent flying with a backhanded blow that cracked against the corridor wall with sickening force. Park fired, the pulse round striking her shoulder. She didn't even flinch, simply turning her gaze on him as Wallace struggled for air in her grasp. Her size in the open corridor was even more terrifying than it had been in the cell. She filled the space completely, her shoulders nearly scraping both walls, her head bent slightly beneath the ceiling. Carter knew he should run, should call for backup, should do anything except what he did next. He stepped forward, directly into her line of sight, and spoke, not shouting, not commanding, just quiet words in the chaos. "This isn't you." The world seemed to hold its breath, her gaze locked with his, recognition flickering behind the rage. For a moment he thought she would crush Wallace anyway, would tear through all of them in her fury. Then slowly, her grip loosened. Wallace dropped to the floor, gasping and clutching his throat. She staggered backward, eyes never leaving Carter's face. Her hands were shaking, her massive frame suddenly seeming less threatening than vulnerable. Confusion and something like shame passed across her alien features. And then she backed away. Step by step, she retreated into the cell, dropping to her knees beside the scattered arrangement of objects on the floor. Even kneeling, she towered over everyone in the corridor, but her posture now was one of submission, of waiting. Park was shouting into his communicator, calling for a security team. Alarms began wailing throughout the facility. Wallace was still on the ground, wheezing. Diaz hadn't moved from where he'd fallen, but all Carter could see was her, kneeling in her cell, head bowed, waiting for whatever punishment would come. The Security Council chamber hummed with tension. 12 hours had passed since the incident. Wallace was in the medical bay with severe tracheal damage. Diaz had suffered a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The facility remained on high alert, with armed guards stationed at every junction. Absolutely not. The specimen has proven itself irremediably dangerous. Termination is the only option. Warden Kell's voice carried through the conference room, silencing the murmurs of the assembled Security Council. Carter stood at the back of the room, officially there to give his statement but actually present because Voss had insisted, a calculated move to ensure he witnessed the consequences of his actions. The council itself was composed of the facility's highest-ranking officials. Kell at the head of the table, flanked by Voss and Dr. Nakamura, the chief research scientist. Around them sat the section chiefs, security coordinators, and a holographic representative from the governing authority, their face deliberately obscured. "With respect, sir," Carter said, drawing all eyes to him, "termination would be a mistake." Kell's expression hardened. "You're out of line, Reed." "The specimen reacted to provocation," Carter continued, stepping forward. "Wallace and Diaz were taunting her, violating protocol. I witnessed it myself." "Her," Kell repeated, eyebrows rising. "Interesting choice of pronoun for a creature that nearly killed 2 of our staff." "A creature that showed restraint," Carter countered. "She could have killed all of us. She chose not to." Murmurs rippled through the room again. Voss was watching him with an unreadable expression, neither supporting nor condemning. From his seat at the table, Lieutenant Harlow leaned forward, eyes burning with barely contained contempt. "This is precisely what I warned about in my reports. Reed has developed an unhealthy attachment to the specimen. He's compromised." Dr. Nakamura's thin voice cut through the tension. "Actually, I find Reed's observations quite interesting from a research perspective. The specimen does appear to have demonstrated remarkable restraint given its physical capabilities." "That's not restraint," Harlow snapped. "It's calculation. The thing is smart enough to know killing everyone would guarantee its own termination." "Or," Voss interjected, surprising Carter with what almost seemed like support, "it recognized Reed and responded to him. That suggests cognitive capabilities far beyond what we've officially documented." "Which makes it even more dangerous," Kell concluded. "She's only dangerous when treated like an animal," Carter finished, meeting Kell's gaze directly. Harlow slammed his hand on the table. "With all due respect, this is absurd. Reed has no special insight here. He's a junior security officer with minimal xenobiological training who's developed an obsession with the specimen. I've documented his unsanctioned visits, his provision of contraband, his violation of direct orders." "That's enough, Lieutenant," Voss interrupted, her tone sharp. Harlow's face flushed with anger, but he fell silent, shooting Carter a look of pure hatred. The warden studied Carter for a long moment, then a cold smile spread across his face. "You seem very confident in that assessment, Reed. Very invested in this specimen's welfare." "I believe in ethical treatment, sir, regardless of origin." "Ethical treatment." Kell nodded slowly, then turned to the security team. "Clear the room. Everyone except Reed." As the others filed out, casting curious glances over their shoulders, Carter maintained his position, back straight, expression neutral. Only when the door sealed shut did Kell approach him, stopping uncomfortably close. "You want to protect this creature? Fine. Let's put your theory to the test." Kell's voice dropped to a near whisper. "How about we lock you in with it? See how long your kindness lasts when you're sharing breathing space with something that can tear you limb from limb." Carter's pulse jumped, but he kept his expression steady. "Is that an order, sir?" "It's an opportunity," Kell replied, his smile widening. "Prove your theory correct, and I'll consider alternatives to termination. Prove yourself wrong, and, well, the problem solves itself, doesn't it?" Carter understood then. This wasn't a test. It was an execution, just with plausible deniability. If the alien killed him, Kell would have justification for immediate termination. If she didn't, he'd find another excuse. But it was also the only chance she had. "I accept," Carter said simply. Kell blinked, clearly not expecting such ready agreement. "You understand the conditions? No weapons, no communication devices, just you and it, until I decide the test is complete." "I understand." An hour later, Carter stood outside Cell 9, now repaired with a reinforced door and additional security measures. 2 armed guards flanked him, while Kell and Voss observed from a safe distance. "Last chance to reconsider," Voss said quietly as one of the guards inputted the access code. Carter shook his head. "I'll be fine." "Your confidence is either admirable or delusional," she replied, but there was something in her tone that wasn't entirely dismissive. "If you survive this, Reed, I'd be interested to know what you learn." The door slid open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the cell. She was there, in the far corner, restraints reattached and reinforced after the incident. Her head was bowed, but Carter could feel her awareness of his presence. He stepped inside without hesitation. The door sealed behind him with a definitive hiss, the lock engaging with a heavy thunk. No exits, no backup, no weapons, just silence. And fear, though whether it was his or hers he couldn't tell. For what felt like hours, neither of them moved. Carter remained standing near the door, giving her space, while she stayed hunched in her corner, impossibly still. The only sound was their breathing, his light and controlled, hers deeper, slower. Finally, Carter took a careful step forward, then another. She tensed visibly but didn't react otherwise. When he was halfway across the cell, he slowly sat down, cross-legged on the floor. "I'm Carter," he said quietly, the first words he'd ever directly spoken to her. "Carter Reed." She lifted her head slightly, those amber eyes reflecting what little light there was in the cell. She didn't respond, but he hadn't expected her to. "I'm sorry about what happened," he continued. "Wallace and Diaz shouldn't have done that to you." Still no response, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the angle of her shoulders relaxing by fractions of a degree. "I'm going to be staying here for a while," he explained, keeping his voice calm and even. "Warden Kell's orders. He thinks you'll kill me." At this, she finally moved, lifting her head fully to look at him. Her expression was unreadable, alien features arranged in a way his human brain couldn't quite interpret. But her eyes, those he could read, confusion, wariness, and something like curiosity. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted forward, the chains attached to her restraints clinking softly. When she was directly across from him, mirroring his cross-legged position, she stopped. Then, to Carter's astonishment, she extended one massive hand toward him. Resting in her palm was a metal tray, her food tray, with the day's meager rations still untouched upon it. An offering. Carter stared at it, understanding dawning slowly. She thought he was being punished by being placed with her, that he would be denied food as she had been, and she was sharing what little she had. "Thank you," he said quietly, making no move to take it. "But that's for you. You need to eat." She tilted her head, clearly not understanding his words but sensing his refusal. Her brow furrowed, and she pushed the tray closer to him, insistent. Carter realized this might be a crucial moment in establishing trust. He reached out slowly and took a small piece of the synthetic bread, making a show of eating it. Then he gently pushed the tray back toward her. "Together," he said, gesturing between them. For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Then, with movements that seemed almost ceremonial, she broke the remaining bread in two exact halves, offering one back to him. Carter accepted it with a nod. They ate in silence, watching each other across the small space that separated them. It wasn't much of a meal, but it felt like the beginning of something important. Outside the cell, Lieutenant Harlow stood in the observation room, watching the scene unfold with growing disgust. He'd expected blood by now, had waited almost eagerly for the moment when the alien would reveal its true nature and tear Reed apart. Instead, he was watching them share a meal, like friends, like equals. It was wrong. All wrong. "Sir," he said, turning to Kell, who stood nearby, "this isn't a valid test. Reed is clearly manipulating the situation." Kell's expression remained neutral. "How so, Lieutenant?" Harlow gestured at the monitor, struggling to articulate what seemed so obvious to him. "He's treating it like it's human, like it can be reasoned with." "And that invalidates the test how exactly?" Voss asked from her position by the door. Harlow's jaw tightened. "The specimen needs to be terminated, ma'am. We all know it. This charade is just delaying the inevitable." "Are you questioning the warden's decision?" Voss's voice had an edge that would have warned a wiser man to retreat, but Harlow was beyond caution now. "I'm questioning the wisdom of risking valuable personnel on the whims of a junior officer who's clearly compromised." "Careful, Lieutenant," Kell said softly. "Your personal feelings about Reed are becoming rather transparent." Harlow flushed. "This isn't personal, sir. It's about facility security." He hesitated, then added with barely contained bitterness, "Reed is a rising threat to everything we've built here. His sympathy for these creatures could undermine our entire containment protocol." "Is it?" Voss raised an eyebrow. "Because your reports on Reed have been remarkably thorough, almost obsessive." Harlow opened his mouth to retort, then closed it, realizing he was on dangerous ground. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." "Then continue doing it elsewhere," Kell said dismissively. "You're relieved from observation duty." Harlow stood rigid for a moment, humiliation burning through him. Then he nodded stiffly and left, his steps echoing down the corridor. He would not forget this. would not forgive it. Reed would pay. And so would his alien pet. Days passed in strange, tense coexistence. The cell, designed for a single occupant, felt simultaneously too small and too vast. Carter slept in fitful bursts, always aware of her presence, always half expecting to wake to those amber eyes directly above him, to feel powerful hands closing around his throat. But she kept her distance, maintaining an invisible boundary between them. During waking hours, she watched him constantly, studying his every movement with intense focus. When he paced the cell to keep his muscles from atrophying, she tracked him with her eyes. When he spoke, mostly to himself, to break the oppressive silence, she tilted her head as if trying to decipher the sounds. Food came once daily, pushed through the slot without comment. Always a single tray, clearly meant for one. A test, or perhaps a form of psychological torture, forcing them to compete for sustenance. But each time she divided everything with precise fairness. Carter tried to refuse, to insist she take more, but she was implacable. Equal shares or she wouldn't eat at all. On the third day, the water ration was accidentally forgotten. By evening, Carter's throat was parched, his lips cracking. She noticed his discomfort, watching as he tried to ration the last few drops from the previous day's cup. Then she moved to the small sink in the corner of the cell and placed her hands against the wall beside it, tilting her head as if listening. A moment later, she dug her strong fingers into the seam where pipe met wall and pulled. Metal groaned, then gave way. A thin trickle of water began to leak from the damaged connection. She cupped her hands beneath it, collecting the precious liquid, then turned and held it out to Carter. When he hesitated, she made a soft, urgent sound. The first vocalization he'd heard from her that wasn't a growl. Carter knelt beside her and drank from her cupped hands, the water cool against his parched throat. After he finished, she carefully bent the pipe to slow the leak to an occasional drip, preserving the resource rather than exhausting it. Intelligence, foresight, compassion. That night, for the first time, Carter slept deeply, no longer afraid of the being with whom he shared the cell. On the fifth day, everything changed. Carter woke feeling strange, his skin hot and dry, his thoughts foggy. When he tried to stand, the cell tilted alarmingly around him, forcing him back to the floor. Fever. Dehydration, maybe, despite their careful rationing of the leaking pipe's water. Or perhaps something deliberate in the food they'd been given. She noticed immediately, moving to his side with surprising speed. Her cool hand pressed against his forehead, her expression changing to something he recognized even through the haze of fever: concern. As the day progressed, his condition worsened. Chills racked his body, his vision blurred, his breathing became labored. She tried everything, tearing strips from her own rough garment to create cool compresses, urging him to drink the precious water she collected. When the fever made him delirious, she held him still to prevent injury, her strength gentle but immovable. Through the fog of illness, Carter was distantly aware of voices outside the cell. Medical personnel, discussing his condition in clinical terms. Refusing to intervene. Part of Kell's test, he realized dimly. They were waiting to see what she would do. Whether she would take advantage of his weakness. Instead, she cared for him with single-minded focus, ignoring the meager food when it arrived, using the water only to cool his fever. By evening, Carter was slipping in and out of consciousness, his body shutting down from dehydration and whatever illness had taken hold. In a moment of clarity, he looked up at her, seeing the frustration and fear in those alien eyes. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Not your fault." She made a low sound in response, something between a growl and a whine. Then, with sudden decision, she moved to the cell door and began to tear it apart. The reinforced metal that had been designed to contain her full strength gave way beneath her desperate assault. Alarms shrieked to life throughout the facility. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor beyond in crimson. She turned back to Carter, gathering his limp form in her arms with surprising gentleness. Her massive hands, each large enough to engulf his entire head, cradled him against her chest as if he were made of glass. Then she stepped through the ruined doorway and into chaos. Guards converged from both directions, weapons raised. She hunched protectively over Carter, her enormous body creating a living shield around his much smaller form. Her size in the open corridors was staggering. She had to bend nearly double to navigate the spaces designed for humans. Yet she moved with surprising grace and speed. She didn't retreat. Instead, she advanced, her intention clear, to get him medical attention, regardless of the cost to herself. The first stun round hit her square in the chest. She staggered but didn't fall. The second struck her shoulder, then a third. Still, she moved forward. Carter clutched against her. Guards switched to batons as she reached their line, bringing the electric prods down across her back, her legs, her arms. She roared in pain but didn't release her burden. Just kept moving, one agonizing step at a time, toward the medical bay at the far end of the complex. Through his fading consciousness, Carter felt the impacts as they struck her, felt her muscles tense with each blow. Blue blood, thick and viscous, dripped onto his face from her wounds. Yet still she carried him, absorbing every hit, taking every stun round. 5 levels of security she breached, leaving destruction and stunned guards in her wake. Not from her violence, but from her unstoppable determination. When they finally reached the outer doors of the medical bay, she collapsed to her knees, still holding him protectively. Her massive body shuddered with exhaustion and pain. Guards surrounded them, weapons trained on her head. Even kneeling and wounded, she dwarfed them all, her tremendous size making the armed humans look like children in comparison. But she ignored them all, focusing only on Carter as his eyes fluttered open one last time. She looked at him and in a voice rough from disuse but perfectly clear, spoke her first words to him. Live. Then she gently laid him down at the threshold of the medical bay and raised her hands in surrender. Carter awoke in the sterile white of the medical unit, the steady beep of monitoring equipment his first awareness. His body felt leaden, his thoughts sluggish from medication. As his vision cleared, he became aware of a figure seated beside his bed. Voss, her expression uncharacteristically somber. Welcome back, she said simply. You've been unconscious for nearly 30 hours. Carter tried to speak, found his throat too dry, accepted the water she offered. Where is she? He asked when he could form words. Voss's face remained neutral. Contained, for now. Is she hurt? She took 17 stun rounds and multiple baton strikes, enough to kill most species we've encountered. A pause. She's healing, faster than our medical team thought possible. Carter closed his eyes briefly in relief. Then, Enkel? Furious, embarrassed. Your alien friend breached 5 security levels carrying you. The footage has been seen by everyone in the facility. Voss leaned forward slightly. She didn't harm a single person, Reed. Not even those actively trying to stop her. Just kept moving toward medical, like she knew exactly where to go. She's intelligent, Carter said. More than anyone here wants to admit. Clearly, Voss studied him for a moment. Kell wants her terminated, claims she's proven herself too dangerous to contain. Carter struggled to sit up. She saved my life. I know. Voss raised a hand to silence him. The decision has been delayed, pending review by higher authorities. I need to see her. You're in no condition. Please. Something in his tone must have reached her, because after a long moment, Voss nodded. When you're stable, not before. One more thing, she added, her expression growing grave. Lieutenant Harlow has been problematic since the incident. His antagonism toward you has escalated to something concerning. He's been temporarily relieved of duty, but be careful. Men like that rarely let go of a grudge. Voss left shortly after, and Carter drifted back to sleep, his body still recovering from the fever and dehydration. The medical bay was quiet, the night shift operating with minimal staff as the facility's day cycle ended. It was the soft hiss of the door that woke him. Carter's eyes opened to semi-darkness, the medical bay illuminated only by the glow of monitoring equipment and emergency lighting. A shadow moved near the entrance, tall, uniform silhouette unmistakable even in the dim light. Harlow. Carter remained still, controlling his breathing, watching through barely open eyes as the lieutenant approached his bed. There was something wrong about his movements. Too fluid, too careful. This wasn't an official visit. Harlow stopped at the foot of the bed, checking something on the medical readout. Then, with deliberate care, he removed something from his pocket, a small cylindrical device that Carter couldn't identify in the darkness. You think you're so special, Harlow whispered, his voice barely audible. The alien whisperer, the hero who survived. He moved to the 4th stand beside Carter's bed, examining the medication pouch with clinical detachment. It should have killed you, he continued, turning the small device over in his hands. That was the plan. Put you in there, let nature take its course, problem solved. But you had to ruin it, didn't you? With practiced precision, Harlow inserted the device into the medication port on Carter's IV line. This will look like a reaction to treatment, he said, adjusting something on the device. Unfortunate, but not suspicious. Happens sometimes with the medication they're giving you for the fever. Respiratory depression, cardiac arrest, all very standard complications. Carter's mind raced. His body was still weak, his reactions slowed by medication. The call button was within reach, but Harlow would see him move for it. And even if he managed to press it, help would take precious seconds to arrive. Seconds he might not have once whatever was in that device entered his bloodstream. Harlow stepped back, watching the IV line with cold satisfaction. Nothing personal. Well, maybe a little personal. A humorless smile twisted his features. But mostly it's about the greater good. You and that thing. You're a liability, a threat to everything we've built here. Carter saw his chance. With a sudden surge of desperate strength, he yanked the IV from his arm and lunged for Harlow. The lieutenant stumbled backward, surprised by the attack, but recovered quickly, grabbing Carter's throat with both hands. I was trying to be merciful, Harlow hissed, tightening his grip. Quick, painless, but this works too. Carter fought for breath, his weakened body betraying him as he clawed at Harlow's hands. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. He was going to lose consciousness soon. With one final effort, Carter's hand found the metal tray of medical instruments beside the bed. He swung it blindly, connecting with the side of Harlow's head with a satisfying crack. The lieutenant's grip loosened just enough for Carter to break free, gasping for air. The commotion had finally triggered the medical bay's sensors. Alarms blared, and the main lights flashed on, bathing the scene in harsh fluorescence. Harlow straightened, blood trickling from a gash above his temple. His eyes darted to the doorway, where security would appear any second. In one fluid motion, he pulled his service weapon, aiming it at Carter's chest. I tried to do this quietly, he said, voice eerily calm. No one would have questioned it. Just another casualty of your alien encounter. Now look what you've done. Carter stared down the barrel of the weapon, too weak to move, too stubborn to beg. Go ahead, he managed, his voice raspy from Harlow's assault. Prove me right about who the real monster is in this facility. Harlow's finger tightened on the trigger, then froze as the doors hissed open. Voss stood in the entrance, her own weapon trained on Harlow's back. Lieutenant, she said, her voice like ice, lower your weapon. For one terrible moment, Carter thought Harlow might fire anyway, might decide to complete his mission regardless of the consequences. But then slowly, the lieutenant lowered the gun. He attacked me, Harlow said, adopting a tone of wounded professionalism. Delirious from the fever, I was defending myself. With a lethal injection device? Voss asked, gesturing to the cylinder now hanging from the discarded IV line. Interesting choice of defense. Harlow's expression hardened as he realized the game was up. You don't understand what's happening here, he said, looking between Voss and Carter. That thing is changing him, influencing him somehow. He's compromised, they both are. Voss nodded to the security team that had filed in behind her. Lieutenant Harlow, you're under arrest for attempted murder of facility personnel. As they moved to restrain him, she added, and for the record, the only one compromised here is you. As they led Harlow away, his eyes locked with Carter's one last time. There was no remorse there, no recognition of wrongdoing, only cold certainty. It should have killed you, Harlow said again, his voice carrying across the medical bay. And when it finally does, remember, I tried to warn you. It was another day before Carter was deemed strong enough to leave his bed, and even then, only in a wheelchair, an orderly assigned to push him. His destination wasn't Cell 9, that had been decommissioned after the damage, but a new holding room in the high security wing. As they approached, Carter could see the extra precautions that had been taken. Double doors, enhanced barrier fields, at least 6 armed guards stationed in the corridor. Overkill, he thought, or perhaps not, given what she'd proven herself capable of. 2 of the guards visibly tensed as Carter approached, their hands shifting to rest on their weapons. Word of Harlow's attempt on his life had spread through the facility like wildfire, along with rumors about his connection to the alien. Some believed Harlow's claims that Carter had been somehow compromised or influenced by the specimen. Others simply saw him as a traitor to his own kind. 10 minutes, Voss said, having joined them for the transfer. That's all I can authorize. Carter nodded his understanding as the first set of doors slid open. The orderly pushed him through, then retreated, leaving him alone as the doors sealed behind him. Ahead lay the second barrier, transparent but reinforced, allowing him to see into the holding room beyond. She was there, kneeling in the center of the bare space. Heavy restraints encircled her wrists, ankles, and neck, connected to the floor by chains that allowed minimal movement. Her body bore the evidence of her ordeal. Dark bruises across her visible skin, half-healed lacerations on her arms and face. But it was the posture that struck Carter most deeply. Head bowed, shoulders slumped. Defeated in a way she hadn't been even during her starvation. The inner barrier dissolved at his approach, a temporary deactivation. She looked up at the sound, her amber eyes widening at the sight of him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Carter forced himself to stand from the wheelchair, his legs shaky but determined. One step, then another, closing the distance between them. She watched him approach, her gaze moving over him as if checking for injuries, lingering on the medical band around his wrist, the pallor of his skin. "You're alive," she said, her voice still rough but stronger than before. Carter nodded, kneeling carefully before her so they were at eye level. "Because of you." "They will kill me for it," she stated without fear or regret, just certainty. "No," Carter said firmly. "I won't let them." A sound escaped her that might have been a laugh, short and harsh. "You cannot stop them. No one can." "Why did you do it?" Carter asked. "You could have escaped. Once you broke through the door, you could have fought your way out. Why risk everything to save me?" She looked at him for a long moment, those alien eyes somehow conveying emotions his human brain could interpret. "You fed me," she said finally, the words slow and deliberate. "When I was starving, when no one saw me as anything but monster." Her large hands opened, then closed. "Now I cannot let you starve." The simplicity of it, the fundamental cross-species understanding of debt and gratitude, struck Carter to his core. Blood smeared the floor around them, her blood still seeping from wounds that hadn't fully closed. The heavy collar around her neck had rubbed her skin raw. Yet she knelt before him not with resentment, but with a strange dignity. The collar itself was a cruel device, more sophisticated than the simple restraints on her wrists and ankles. It encircled her throat completely, a band of black metal embedded with control circuitry. Small lights pulsed along its surface, monitoring vitals, tracking movement, ready to deliver pain at the press of a remote button. Carter looked at the guards visible through the barrier, at the cameras monitoring their every move. Then deliberately he reached for the collar around her neck. Her eyes widened in alarm. "No," she breathed. "They will kill you." "Let them try," Carter replied, finding the locking mechanism. It required a key, of course, a key he didn't have. But as his fingers explored the device, he discovered something the security team had overlooked. The collar, designed for a creature of her size, was adjustable, and the adjustment mechanism, when manipulated correctly, created just enough slack. With a soft click, the collar came free in his hands. The weight of it surprised him. Several pounds of advanced technology and reinforced metal, designed not just to restrain, but to subjugate, to remind the wearer constantly of their captivity, their powerlessness. She stared breathless as he held the heavy restraint in his hands. Around them, alarms began to sound. Red lights flashed outside the holding room. Guards shouted, weapons charged. She watched him, utterly still, her gaze never leaving his face. Then slowly she reached up and touched her bare neck, fingers tracing the raw skin where the collar had been. A gesture so human in its wonder, in its disbelief at newfound freedom. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then with movements deliberate and precise, she reached out and took the collar from his hands. Carter tensed, not understanding at first. She held the device between them, studying it, turning it over in her large blue hands. Then, with devastating gentleness, she placed it in his palms and folded his fingers around it, and waited. The meaning was unmistakable. The choice was his. He could place the collar back around her neck, return to the safety of human society, to the comfort of the familiar. He could tell himself he'd done what he could, shown what kindness was possible within the system's constraints. Or he could truly set her free, accept the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. Outside, the security team was preparing to breach the room. He could hear Voss shouting orders, the whine of weapons powering up. Time was running out. Carter looked down at the collar in his hands, then at her face. Alien, yet somehow more familiar to him now than any human countenance. In her eyes, he saw neither pleading nor demand, just quiet acceptance of whatever he would choose. The collar felt impossibly heavy in his hands, its weight seeming to grow with each passing second. The weight of every assumption, every fear, every barrier humans had built between themselves and the unknown. Without a word, Carter stood and walked to the waste disposal unit embedded in the wall. He dropped the collar inside, pressed the activation button. The device vanished with a soft hiss of compressed air, irretrievably destroyed. When he turned back to her, she was standing too, her full height impressive even with the chain still binding her limbs. Standing upright, she was a living mountain. 11 feet of blue skin power, her head nearly touching the ceiling of the holding room, her shoulders broader than any humans could ever be. But it was the expression on her face that took his breath away. Something beyond gratitude, beyond relief. Recognition of one sentient being to another. "Breach in progress," a voice shouted from the corridor. Not one of the regular guards, but a familiar, hate-filled tone that made Carter's blood run cold. Harlow. Somehow he'd escaped custody. The security feed on the wall flickered to life, showing chaos in the corridor outside. Harlow had overpowered his escorts during transfer, had taken a weapon. Now he was forcing his way toward the holding room, his face a mask of fanatical determination. "Override code Tango 91 Kappa," he was shouting into the security panel. "Emergency termination protocol." The system responded with warning klaxons. On the feed, Carter could see blast shields beginning to lower around the holding room, the facility's final containment measure. Once sealed, the room could be flooded with lethal gas or depressurized entirely, a fail-safe meant for worst-case scenarios, a scenario Harlow was determined to create. "He's initiating a purge," Carter said, turning to her. "We have less than 30 seconds. She looked at the monitor, then at the remaining restraints on her wrists and ankles. With a grunt of effort, she strained against them. Metal groaned, but held. "Together," Carter said, moving to her side. He grabbed one of the restraints, pulling with every ounce of strength he had left. She did the same, their combined effort finally causing the metal to give way with a sharp crack. One limb free, then another. Time ticking away. On the monitor, they could see Harlow fighting through the security team that had responded to the alarms. Voss among them, trying to stop the override, but he had the advantage of surprise and desperation. 10 seconds to purge, the automated system announced. They had freed 3 limbs. One ankle restraint remained, its reinforced construction proving stubborn even to her strength. "Go," she told Carter, pushing him toward the exit. "There is time for you." Carter shook his head, still pulling at the final restraint. "Not without you." 5 seconds to purge. With a roar of defiance, she gave one final, tremendous pull. The restraint tore free, taking a chunk of the floor with it. Purge initiated. As the security team breached the outer door, as Voss shouted his name in warning, Carter stepped toward the alien woman and extended his hand. She took it without hesitation, her blue fingers, massive enough to engulf his entire hand, entwining with his pink ones. Then she pulled him close, her enormous frame shielding him as alarms blared around them. "You fed me," she said, her voice low and resonant in the chaos. "Now you are mine." Whatever came next, they would face it together.